the world, I'm seeing more clear now. I'ma take you on with no fear now. When struggles ever brought me down, and it's not gonna happen now. Cause I'm a warrior, I'm a champion, I'm a fighter, I'm not giving in. So bring it on, I'm ready for the fight, and I'ma survive this right. Everything gon' be alright, everything gon' be alright. Say, everything gon' be alright, everything gon' be alright. Say, there's so much joy, why don't we feel it? Can we feel it now? There's so much pain, oh can we heal it? Can we heal it now? The fight is never ours alone, we're all in this together. Yeah. One love, all you need is love. Give a little love, give a little love. What if you were told that today was the last day of your life? Did you live it right? Love is a gift you give away, and it reignites. Don't wait, no, don't let it pass you by. We feel awake, time is short, so celebrate. See the beauty of every day, live the moments that we create. Find the love in the empty space. Life's a gift, so let's give thanks. Appreciate, just don't wait, yeah, just don't wait. Come on, just don't wait, come on. Let it pass you by. There's so much joy, why don't we feel it? Can we feel it now? There's so much pain, oh can we heal it? Can we heal it now? The fight is never ours alone, we're all in this together. Yeah. One love, all you need is love. Give a little love, give a little love. What if you were told that today was the last day of your life? Did you live it right? Love is a gift you give away, and it reignites. Don't wait, no, don't let it pass you by. Don't let it pass you by. What if you were told that today was the last day of your life? Did you live it right? Love is a gift you give away, and it reignites. Don't wait, don't let it pass you by. Don't wait, don't let it pass you by. It's gonna be alright. Don't let it pass you by. What if you were told that today was the last day of your life? Did you live it right? Love is a gift you give away, and it reignites. Don't wait, don't let it pass you by. Don't wait, don't wait, don't let it pass you by. Don't let it pass you by. It's gonna be alright. It'll be alright. It'll be alright.
Good morning. It looks like we're going to go ahead and get started. If Emily, you can start your presentation.
Yeah, so everybody, we're building a community. Please introduce yourself and share where you are joining us from this afternoon in the chat. That would be wonderful. Everyone's going to be muted until the end of the hour or towards the end of the hour when we'll have participant reflection. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the hour in the chat. And then you can also use the raise your hand function later on. And you will receive a link to the recording and presentation by the end of the week. Next slide. This activity is jointly provided by the United South and Eastern Tribes and Cardia Services. I am sharing a link in the chat. We are offering continuing nursing, medical, counseling, and social work units for attending this hour. You can also, if you weren't able to stay with us the whole time, you can also watch it on YouTube when we share the recording and get those continuing education units. I will share that link periodically throughout so everybody has it. And it will also be shared later on. And you can get 1 credit for this. And then, yeah, upon successful completion of this activity, you get 1 contact hour. If you have any questions, please contact Paige O'Sullivan at Cardia Services or any of the USET staff, and we can link you up with her. And there are no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies for those involved with the ability to control the content of this activity. And that is all.
Good morning, Mitako Oyase. Welcome, All My Relations. I'm Bernice Jordan. I'm a citizen of the Fort Peck Sioux Nation, Montana. I'm a public health program manager for USET. And I'd like to welcome you all today. We want to do a land acknowledgement. Just to let you know, you are currently standing on Indigenous land. If you text this number, 907-312-5085, it will actually tell you where you're located, or you can go onto this link. Next slide. So thanks for being a part of our Reclaiming Our Collective Stories. So each of these dots actually represents a collaborative effort from everyone that is on this call and from previous calls, and it reflects on this map here. So there are a lot of red dots. Next slide. And I want to introduce Holly Echohawk, as we're all familiar with her from all the previous sessions. Holly, you can go ahead and get started.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Happy to see you all. Glad you could join us today. I'm Holly Echohawk, and I'm a senior behavioral health advisor to this wonderful tribal echo on reclaiming Native psychological brilliance. And you know, what our whole premise is that to celebrate the fact that Native people are inherently intelligent. It's in our DNA. And we start with that premise and we end with that premise. We just want to show you, I'm not going to go through these, but you can see the topics that we've had so far this year. This was our first year. We launched in January, and we are working on 2023 schedule. So if you can go to the next slide. And I am just super happy that Professor Joe Gahn is joining us today. Professor Gahn and I have worked together as friends and colleagues for years, and there is no finer example of Native intelligence than Professor Joe Gahn. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself, and you all are in for a wonderful treat to listen to Dr. Joe Gahn.
Well, thank you, Holly, and thanks to all the USET staff for getting this keyed up, and looks like it's flowing very smoothly at this point. I'm delighted to join you. Thanks for the invitation to have a chance to share some thoughts with you today. As you can see from this title slide, I'm going to be speaking to you about rethinking American Indian mental health services, explorations in alternative science. And I'll explain what that alternative science is about when I get to the appropriate point. Let me start today, though, by first acknowledging that I am talking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm a professor at Harvard University. And so in close consultation with the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapog, we've worked on an acknowledgement of land and people. Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. It's important to do these kinds of acknowledgements, as you know, for a bunch of reasons, but it's especially true when you're a visitor to someone else's territory. And I'm from Montana originally. I am an enrolled member of the Ani-Grovant tribal nation, Fort Belknap, Montana. On my dad's side, I come from the Azure and the Brisboe families. On my mom's side, from the Gahn and the Crazy families. And you can hear that I carry my mom's surname. I always say it's a good thing she did not hyphenate her last name, or it'd be a psychologist named Dr. Gahn Crazy, which might make it difficult to attract a clientele. I don't actually practice psychology, though. I'm more of a researcher. And so let me tell you a little bit more about my academic work before launching into the presentation for today. As I say, I'm an academic psychologist, important to say, because obviously when you think of psychologists, you might think of a therapist. And I am clinically trained. I know how to do therapy, but my work has largely been more community engaged with American Indian and other indigenous nations. And therefore, because of that, it's very culturally attuned in all kinds of important ways. My research interests, broadly construed, are at this intersection of culture, coloniality, and mental health. We could even put mental health in quotes, maybe psychological well-being. There's probably better terms for it. But because of this, I have been interested for a long time in indigenous psychologies, or facets of indigenous mind and mentality that might look a little different than what we know in the mental health professions. And of course, in cross-cultural therapies, as we're obviously very concerned about how to be actually helpful to people who are suffering or in distress. What I want to do for you today is to really break this presentation in half. I'm told to talk for about no more than 40 minutes, so I'm going to pay careful attention to the time here to make sure that I honor that. So first, I'm just going to share with you an early career lesson, something I discovered really after my doctoral work in my very first research project back home at Fort Belknap, that has sort of shaped the trajectory or the pathway of my career ever since. And then I'll share with you a framework that I've developed over the course of the past 2.5 decades that tries to really explain and capture an alternative, a way that Native people in our communities tend to think about the mental health endeavor. So let me start with the early career lesson. I got my doctorate in 2001 from the University of Illinois. This was work that I undertook, basically the late 90s into the early 2000s. As you all are perfectly familiar, our Indian communities, indigenous communities tend to suffer from mental health inequities of various kinds. We have, in some of our communities, pretty epidemic levels of distress. This includes a very high prevalence of trauma, substance abuse, and suicide. Those tend to be the three that most stand out in formal scientific surveys of mental health problems in Indian country. As I think you also know, the community mental health services that are on offer are pretty deeply underfunded. And therefore, we have kind of a large unmet mental health need in too many of our communities. So we might wonder what to do about that. How do we remedy these mental health inequities? Well, if we have pronounced mental health problems in many of our communities on the one hand, but our services in those communities that are designed to remedy those are underfunded on the other hand, then it seems pretty straightforward, fairly intuitive. We just need to expand our mental health services. We need to fund them. We need to get more providers. We need to make sure everyone who needs help can come into the tribal clinic and get mental health support, right? Seems intuitive, seems common sense. Well, this early period of inquiry that I undertook back at home on Fort Belknap, 20 some years ago, really made me question this simple, intuitive solution. Basically, I went home to hold at bay or to bracket or to set aside all of the professional knowledge and training I had received about mental health in order to first and foremost try to proceed in open-ended and discovery-oriented fashion how people in our own communities think about mental health problems, how they understand where they come from, what they're like, what needs to happen to overcome them, and so on. So I set aside all of my professional training to try and understand in some detail local construals of culture, drinking, depression, those sorts of things. And I interviewed members of an extended family and providers and people, leaders on the reservation. But in my work, really one interview really stood out as being especially illuminating. It was an individual who decided in our work together to go by his Indian name of Traveling Thunder. And Traveling Thunder was an interesting person. He was, kind of a grassroots elder or elder in becoming. He had not received extensive mental health help or services. So his view on these was really kind of as more of an outsider, a perspective from someone with a more cultural or traditional orientation. What was most interesting to me is that Traveling Thunder talked about the relationships between culture, problem drinking, and depression at home, and by extension to other Native communities, with reference to 4 historical eras. And in referring to these historical periods, he was really offering what we call in medical anthropology an explanatory model. An explanatory model is an understanding, a conceptualization of what suffering in the mental health domain is like, where it comes from, how it expresses itself, and what you should do to remedy it. And it was interesting to me that Traveling Thunder offered a very fairly coherent explanatory model, again, based on description of 4 historical eras. So let me just review some of this with you. The first era that he described in talking about these kinds of problems was an era that sounded like paradise. It was an era of pre-colonial existence, native life prior to European contact. And here's what he had to say about that. Quote, see, there was no alcohol on this continent 500 years ago. There was no drugs. There was no problems, no domestic problems, no social problems. Everything was good because everybody lived according to custom and teachings. And there was no jails, no hospitals, there was no prisons, no insane asylums. There was none of that stuff because everybody lived according to a strict custom. And so we see that in Traveling Thunder's characterization of pre-colonial existence, he observed kind of this perfect harmony and balance in tribal life, owing to a strict observation of indigenous custom. Now, of course, this was not to last, as we all know. There was a second era, which we might think of as conquest, certainly the era of colonial contact. And here's what Traveling Thunder had to say about that. Quote, but when the white man came, they forced the Indian people to get rid of their way, their religious spiritual beliefs. They forced them to trade their economy, which was based on the barter system and on living off of the land, the wildlife, fish, and herbal medicines. Then they turn around and force their culture on them, their religion, their beliefs, their foreign ways onto them by taking all the young people out of the homes and putting them away in boarding schools and forcing the white man's teachings on them is genocide. So here Traveling Thunder recognized that there was a second period of colonial contact that was all about the annihilation of custom, the devastation of custom, of really forcing white man's teachings on our people instead of adhering to our indigenous traditional practices and customs. This, of course, had a predictable impact, and that is the era that he characterized that sounded with like a lot like loss, really the post-colonial effects or impacts of this period. Here's what he had to say about this era. Quote, if you don't know your own true oral history, your true oral traditions and customs, and where you come from, and what's supposed to be important to you, well, you're going to feel empty. You're going to feel like you don't belong because we don't fit in with the white man system. We never did, and we never will. Basically boils down to pride. If people ain't proud of who they are, where they come from, and what they're doing, then they're going to be doing these things, alcohol, drugs. And once you're into alcohol and drugs, you're going to probably get into a depression. And you're going to not feel worthy of being a human being. You're going to want to kill yourself. And so here in these words, Traveling Thunder traces the impacts of this colonial subjugation by referring to what we might label anomie. Anomie is a word that means no law. And really in the psychological sense, it refers to a loss of identity, of purpose, of belonging, of knowing who you are, what you're supposed to do, the kind of life you're supposed to live. And he's really tracing this kind of anomie, this loss of all of that orienting cultural information as being part of this process to pathology or to suffering. And clearly he's identifying what he referred to over and over again as the white man system as pathogenic in this respect, as the cause of this sort of suffering over time. Now, fortunately, Traveling Thunder didn't think we were lost to this era of post-colonial impact. He talked about a fourth era, an era that is contemporary, an era of cultural and indigenous revitalization, in which he allowed that maybe there's a remedy for some of these post-colonial problems in our communities. Here's what he had to say about that. Quote, after we looked around and realized that we left something behind, we started going back to the hills to fast. We started going to the sweat lodges to pray and to sweat. We started going to the elders to learn. We never was happy living like a white man. I would give the credit to the Creator and to the spirit world for pitying the people to allow us to get our sacred traditions back. To me, what that ceremony does is you're calling on the Creator, the spirit world, for life or for good health or for a good, clean mind, an alcohol and drug-free mind. Or you're calling on the spirit world for guidance, or for survival even survival. And so in this description of indigenous history relative to the origin of mental health problems, he kind of comes full circle here, a return really back to the indigenous customs and practices that kept everything in harmony and balance prior to the arrival of Europeans, but now returning back to those very same customs to try and remedy the problems that are in front of us. So I told you that this stood out to me because it's such a coherent explanatory model. It's a complete account that's fairly coherent about how we have come into the experience of so many mental health issues and what there might be to do about them. Specifically, Traveling Thunder identified a really clear pathological process. I mean, you heard it right in his words. There's colonial subjugation and cultural repression that gives rise to this loss of identity, purpose, and belonging, or anomie, as we might refer to it, that then gives rise to substance abuse, depression, worthlessness, and suicide. Interestingly, Traveling Thunder had really little to say about personal distress, about an individual's suffering. Interestingly, he really offered a fairly non-biological, non-psychological account. In contrast to the mental health professions, where we talk about brain chemistry or genetic predispositions or family dynamics when you're young or those sorts of things, he really talked about history, culture, and spirituality. He didn't really talk about individuals or at the personal level at all, history, culture, and spirituality. Finally, he attributed all of this to the pathogenic aspects of the white man system. In other words, he identified colonization as the foundational or original cause of American Indian distress and suffering. In doing so, he emphasized systemic factors over intrapersonal factors. He wasn't looking inside of each of us as individuals. He's talking about systems that are responsible for creating this legacy of suffering. And he's emphasizing shared community vulnerabilities, that we all went through this together, that we're subject or vulnerable to it together, that we maybe need to come at it together. It's not about this person or that individual. And in this respect, I would refer to you to how we think and talk about historical trauma. I would propose that, this is the way we have tried to capture this perspective of Traveling Thunders and other people's like it in modern healthcare. With Indigenous people, we tend to talk about historical trauma as this legacy of disadvantage that comes from our ancestors through colonial subjugation that we share collectively and so on. Now, one thing that's interesting is Traveling Thunder himself never mentioned the word trauma. Indeed, he didn't have much of a psychology in his explanation at all. So that's probably worth considering a little bit. But in any case, what we would recognize today in Traveling Thunder's words would be called historical trauma. Well, if you're hearing this in the way I did, I immediately wondered, well, then what's the relevance of the kinds of services that are on offer in our IHS clinics or our tribal clinics, where there's, psychosocial helping interventions, therapy, counseling, and that kind of thing. And so I put it to Traveling Thunder after hearing all this. I said, look, given all that you've told me, under what conditions would you take a loved one who is going through a really tough time, maybe a crisis or suffering pretty badly? When would you take them down to the IHS clinic and get them help or counseling for support? Well, he grew quiet in response to that. He thought pretty soberly for what felt like, 15 seconds or something. And then here's what he had to say in response to that. Quote, I guess it's like a war, but they're not using bullets anymore. They want to wipe us out, and therefore the Indian problem will be gone forever. But they're using a more shrewder way than the old style of bullets. If you look at the big picture, you look at your past, your history, where you come from, and you look at your future, where the white man's leading you, I guess you could make a choice. Where do I want to end up? And I guess a lot of people want to end up looking good to the white man. Then it'd be a good thing to do. Go to the white psychiatrist in the Indian Health Service and say, go ahead and rid me of my history, my past, and brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. I guess that'd be a choice each individual will have to make. Now, clearly, Traveling Thunder himself didn't want to make this choice and didn't feel like that would be the way to proceed with a loved one of his who was going through a tough time. But here in these words, he acknowledges that mental health treatment of the kind that we're familiar with in our professional work is a form of cross-cultural encounter for at least some Indian people. That is, it doesn't necessarily dovetail or make sense with the cultural orientations of traditionally minded folks. But more worrisome than that, he's identifying mental health services as ideologically suspect, in fact, because mental health services, according to Traveling Thunder, could be a form of kind of neo-colonial cultural proselytization. Proselytization means like evangelizing your people. And I sometimes say to Indian therapist audiences, maybe we're the missionaries for a new millennium. Maybe we are in some ways carrying out missionary work that converts people in the name of trying to help them into forms of experience and orientation that they didn't really sign on for. And so we return then to the original guess that you might have for how to solve the problem of not enough people getting help, expanding mental health services. But I think what Traveling Thunder tells us is it's not that simple, because we have the problem of cultural difference, which is to say that Europeans and Native people hail from historically distinctive cultural settings that had pretty different cultural orientations and understandings of self and the world. And that these cultural practices continue to persist in at least some really important ways. In fact, I would suggest that there's links culturally between how we think of ourselves as persons and how we conduct ourselves in interpersonal interaction in cultural terms, and big picture questions associated with religious or cosmological understandings. So, for example, when we're careful, what's always observed about us in the mental health literature that, we don't look each other directly in the eye, maybe so comfortably. We use indirection in speech. We don't really tell people what to do. Well, I would suggest that that has religious underpinnings or understandings of the cosmos, in which human beings have to be careful not to slight or offend those higher powers, those beings who we could get help and help from, but who we might intrude on in ways that would be disrespectful. And so the point here is that the norms, the routines, the logics of the mental health clinic are not those of our tribal community, or at least not for a swath of people within our tribal communities who are more traditionally minded. Well, this is the problem of cultural difference. Cultural differences can be worked out in most instances. There could be a meeting of the minds, people can come together, you can talk through why you think what, you can work it out. But it's a lot harder to do that in the context of this problem of cultural dominance. That is, we have this legacy of long-term colonial subjugation by first Europeans and then Euro-Americans, in which the slogan of the boarding schools was very apparent, quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." That tells you what they thought of our cultural practices and orientations, and the enduring power asymmetries that give expression through that slogan are still with us today in ways that complicate our ability to just move through all this. All of this in turn gives rise to what I call the post-colonial predicament of American Indian community mental health, which is that on the one hand, we have pretty urgent community needs. We live often in impoverished, high-risk settings. We have these documented inequities in mental health status. But on the other hand, the clinical services that are on offer to help people in our communities are often incongruent with the mindset and the mentality and the orientation of many of our tribal members. And that means that these services can end up being like an invitation, as Traveling Thunder said, to, quote, "brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man." And this sort of dissonance, this divergence, this contradiction has been attested to, not just by community anecdote, but by research evidence, which has picked up on this. So, for example, in the Great Lakes region, Les Whitbeck and Melissa Walls have done longitudinal work with young people growing up on 8 reserves and reservations, and they've talked to their parents on multiple occasions. And one of their surveys was, well, who would you turn to? Who would you recommend getting help from in a time of crisis or distress or mental health problems? And, mental health professionals didn't even make the top 10. It's just not sort of seen as who you turn to in times of need or crisis. So this was my early career lesson, basically to recognize that all the training and all of the therapeutic technologies and approaches that we're trained in, may seem not only culturally foreign to some members of our community, but ideologically suspect if we're not careful about what they mean and attending to concerns like being brainwashed through them. So early career lesson paves or shapes the way of my subsequent inquiry in all kinds of important ways. And so for the past, coming up on 3 decades now, having partnered in, at least half a dozen different Native communities, both reservation and urban, I have come to recognize a way that Native people, both grassroots people like Traveling Thunder, but also Native therapists, Native administrators, Native health people who are gatekeepers in our communities, have come to think and talk about mental health. And in some ways, the way they think and talk about mental health is not the way professionals talk about it. Is in some ways, like Traveling Thunder, it's a really different perspective. And I've come to call this alternative perspective about mental health in Indian country an alternative science. So alternative, I think you get alternative and alternative. Science, now I'm spelling science here with PSY. And that's because I'm making reference to the authorized knowledge and authority of the so-called psi disciplines in modern life. The psi disciplines are psychiatry, psychology, psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, all that kind of mental health stuff that has generated and traded and trafficked in knowledge, expert knowledge for over a century. And yet this PSY science claims to know a lot of things that run well beyond what data can actually show. The data that we have in many of our fields is really limited. It's often limited to people from a subgroup of really Western affluent nation states. And among that, it's often among undergraduate students in those nation states. And so, there isn't really an SCI science that has all of the authority to ground the knowledge that this kind of science has. That's why I call it an alternative science, to try call into question how relevant the knowledge is from these sciences for Indian people. So this alternative science is an indigenous community mental health discourse. It's an understanding of mental health that comes from our own knowledge, places, experiences, and traditions. It's distinct from, but in many ways parallel to, professional psychiatric discourse. But it contests and recasts key concepts and approaches within psychiatry and psychology. This is evident everywhere I've gone in Indian country when I talk to people who are engaged in the mental health enterprise. And so I want to unpack it a little further for us today before opening up for a few questions. Really, there are 4 domains that I want to talk about with respect to community mental health that I think this alternative science has something different to say than what professionals would say. And those domains are distress, well-being, intervention, and evaluation. Those are the 4 domains. Certainly professionals have plenty to say about each of those domains. I have found in my work over these past decades that Indigenous people have a lot to say about them too in the context of mental health or well-being, but what they have to say is a little different. And so I want to offer some highlights for each of these domains today to just give us a sense and orientation to what that difference might be. Let's start with this first domain of distress. I think most of you know that psychiatry is governed by the Bible of Psychiatry, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. The DSM is a classification of some 300 different mental disorders. And that's what really psychiatrists, and of course, even mental health professionals who don't necessarily believe in everything in that book, they have to give a diagnostic code to get insurance to pay for the therapy they deliver, et cetera. But what I want to suggest to you is when I talk to people in Indian country about suffering and distress, they're not that interested in the DSM. They don't usually use that language even in all the different kinds of DSM disorders. I think there are some reasons for that, some limitations of the way the DSM configures psychiatric suffering or psychological distress. First of all, the DSM disorders are pretty radically decontextualized. They are taken out of your experience, and they're really just signs and symptoms that you have to meet criteria for in order to warrant application of the diagnosis. And so major depression is, a DSM disorder. It doesn't matter if you just went through a horrible divorce. It doesn't matter if you lost your job. It does not matter why you might feel terrible about your life. You either meet criteria or you don't. Substance use disorders. We know that addiction is really rampant in societies that have collapsed or where people's livelihoods have gone away. And yet that's not the kind of thing that anyone thinks about or talks about when applying these criteria. Post-traumatic stress disorder, of course, is all about having a traumatic experience. But what counts as a traumatic experience varies across time and place. And so again, no one cares about really those kinds of details of context. And so the DSM disorders are not very contextualized, which I think is a limitation. A second limitation is they're pretty selectively incomplete. If we were considering post-colonial settings or people who live with the legacy of colonial subjugation like our communities do, we might wonder about things like disorders of rage. I mean, what are we supposed to do with the anger we feel when our loved ones suffer because of the disadvantages that have been systematically wrought by this society and our communities? What about disorders of identity, which is exactly what the boarding schools and lots of other things were intending to disrupt our identities? So selective incompletion is another limitation of the DSM. Finally, there are questions about measurement issues, about how we know whether a person actually meets these criteria. One of the things that the best psychiatric epi work has done has been shown that, if anything, we have lower rates of major depression or clinical depression and lower rates of so-called internalizing disorders in our communities than there are in broad sweeping American respondents. And so one question is whether that's true, we really do have lower, or whether it's just being measured improperly, and therefore we're not registering what the true state is. So there are these limitations. In any case, my point is that when I go throughout Indian country to talk about the nature of our distress, people are not talking DSM, they're not thinking about the DSM so much, rather they're concerned about historical trauma. And as I said, historical trauma is really in some ways what Traveling Thunder was setting up and his explanation for these problems. Historical trauma is really a radical recontextualization of our suffering in history and in power relations. Historical trauma is really just a putting together of two pretty familiar concepts, historical oppression and psychological trauma. You put those together and we end up with historical trauma. As people have promoted this idea, really there are 4 C's of historical trauma that it's helpful to keep straight. It's colonial in origin. It's collectively experienced, not individual, not this person, that person, but our entire communities. It's cumulative across waves of colonial subjugation. So first it might be the army chasing you down, then it's being imprisoned on a reservation, then it's being starved when the rations don't show up, then it's having your kids ripped away and put in boarding school. So it snowballs across this history of colonial subjugation in ways that are cumulative. And finally, it's cross-generational, which is to say that ancestral suffering is somehow, some way passed down the generational lines so that young people today are perhaps more vulnerable to these kinds of problems and suffering than otherwise. And so again, we can sort of see Traveling Thunder's explanation of what this is about. And I give whole talks on historical trauma, so there's certainly more to be said. But right now, my point is just to say for this one domain of distress, it's not DSM mental disorders, but historical trauma that seems to be an indigenous alternative way of framing this domain. Well, if distress is just one domain, what about the second domain, a domain of well-being? Now, interestingly, the mental health professionals don't often think a lot about well-being. They don't often define what well-being means or looks like. It's sort of tacit. But let me suggest to you what indigenous people are not particularly interested in terms of definitions of well-being. Not so much the kind of neoliberal individualism, which is so common like in suburban, upwardly mobile American life. Basically, neoliberal individualism is basically the idea of free agents navigating free markets in autonomous or independent pursuit of happiness and wealth. And I think that would be familiar to lots of Americans, but I don't think that's what Indian people necessarily consider well-being to look like. Rather, I think that we're invested in forms of relational selfhood. Relational, that is to say that who we are is a function of our relations to others in our communities. So obviously that fronts kinship roles and obligations. That is, we have sociocentric self-orientations that link us to close kin with duties and roles and obligations that come with that. And that becomes a really fundamental part of who we are as, when we think of ourselves as individuals. This includes responsibility to and for non-human relatives. So there are other forms of self-configuration that people have pointed out beyond egocentric, which is kind of a deeply individualist, and a sociocentric, which is like the kinship stuff I'm talking about. What about ecocentric? That's very committed and wedded to your ecological surround, or cosmocentric, which has to do with spirit powers and ancestors and things like that. And so there are these relationships that extend beyond just even living humans that we need to take care of. And all of this, I think, gives rise to what I refer to as the social emotions being really paramount or important in terms of how we think about the psychological endeavor. So, the famous psychologist Paul Ekman said there were 6 basic universal human emotions: sad, mad, glad, those kinds of things. But, those are very decontextualized and very individualist. And I do wonder if we don't consider relational forms of selfhood that we wouldn't take up and take on an interest in a number of other emotions which have not been studied very carefully or closely in psychology and psychiatry, the social emotions. So we already talked about, pity, Traveling Thunder mentioned pity, the creator having pity on us, giving us traditions back. Pity is really central to especially Plains religious expressions. You need pity from those powers that are really distant and high above to look down and to help you. In addition, you offer those powers and those beings respect. So in some ways, there's almost like a hierarchy of persons with humans near the bottom, and pity comes down while respect goes up, that hierarchy. That's really common, I think, in some of our religious orientations. Love is, of course, a social emotion. Rather than sadness or depression, maybe loneliness is where the action is, as the medical anthropologist Teresa O'Neill demonstrated with the Salish Flathead community in Montana, 30 years ago. You hear about, dramatic domestic violence in some of our communities stemming from insane jealousy. So there's not only jealousy that's really important, there's an insane form of it that we don't have anything in the DSM to start to capture. What about pouting? We know people who get their feelings hurt, and if they feel slighted and they're off, pouting, or hostility or suspicion or resentment. The point is, there's a whole emotional world that we might experience in the context of relational selfhood that almost no one in psychology has tried to study. And this is in part what I think the indigenous alternative to well-being might entail, not neoliberal individualism, but relational selfhood in all of its forms and implications. Well, if distress is different and well-being is different, what about intervention? Well, intervention, of course, means treatment or helping services. In this case, I don't hear too many Native gatekeepers and professionals and community members feeling very excited about or welcoming of so-called empirically supported treatments or evidence-based practice in mental health. These are, of course, therapies and techniques that are cultivated through human ingenuity and wedded to kind of technical proficiency. And, training involves making sure trainees know and can master the technical proficiency and how to deliver these kinds of therapies. They tend to be certified by very distant and rarefied professional expertise. Really, it's science and scientists and then clinicians who take up the findings of science that really are meant to impress upon us how important it is to use these and why these are the ones that will work. And of course, they're often dependent on forms of what we might call psychological mindedness. Psychological mindedness is kind of an attribute of the self in which one is conditioned and familiar with looking inward, with assessing one's emotional states, with casting your feelings into words, with figuring out who you are as a unique person and how to give voice and expression to your unique individuality, what that might imply for a career path through life. And, psychological mindedness is kind of presumed by a lot of these technologies, these therapies, these approaches. And yet I would suggest to you that most of the world is not particularly enamored by this kind of psychological mindedness. Again, I think it's a myopia or a short-sightedness in our professional world that emphasizes this. So if it's not evidence-based practice for intervention, what is it? Well, I think everywhere I go, there is a great deal of interest and excitement about reclaimed traditional healing practices, about trying to find out the therapeutic precedents and therapeutic approaches that are traditional in our communities and figuring out how to harness those for helping benefit. And so when I go talk to people about different things, I'll hear gatekeepers say, we're not interested in the latest, greatest evidence-based practice. Our culture is our treatment. If we can go back to our traditional ways, that is what's going to help us to heal and to overcome these problems. Now, our culture being our treatment and traditional healing tends to be mediated by ritual leaders using prayer and ceremony. In other words, these are religious endeavors, which recognizes, of course, that health itself in so many of our communities, for so many of our people, is understood to be religious in important ways that biomedicine does not consider. And therefore, health and help through these ways is dependent on powerful non-humans who are able and willing under the right circumstances to circulate blessings and life to us and our communities and our families in ways that drive out sickness and suffering and poverty and so on. And so we have not evidence-based practice of interest, but reclaimed traditional healing practices that Indigenous communities are more interested in. And so if distress is not DSM, but historical trauma, if wellness is not neoliberal individualism, but relational selfhood, If intervention is not evidence-based practice, but instead healing practices, what about this final domain of evaluation? Evaluation is concerned with how we know that a given helping approach works for people. And so the main way that professional expertise construes this evaluation endeavor is to rely on scientific outcome studies, that you need to do rigorously controlled scientific experiments that randomize people to the treatment and the control condition, and then you can see statistically whether the treatment actually helped benefit people who got it versus those who did not get it. Really, these kinds of scientific experiments are a form of extension of our rational prowess or our rational powers. In some ways, we can't see patterns off the tops of our heads when they're really, really subtle. Statistics becomes a way to identify patterns that might run beneath the radar, so to speak, of our own mentality. And so in some ways, these approaches are like cognitive prostheses of sorts. They kind of extend our mental powers to sort of see patterns. They also tend to presume what I call mechanistic materialism. Materialism is the belief that the universe is only composed of matter and energy, and that's it. That the supernatural, the spiritual is not really in play or to be taken seriously. So that's materialism. And then with mechanism, it has to do with the idea that there are these chains of cause and effect. And if we could just understand how the cause and effect chains unfold in the domain of mental health problems, then we can intervene in someone's brain chemistry, or maybe we can, edit their genes or something in utero so that they won't have those problems over time, to intervene in a mechanistic way in, chemicals and developmental processes at the biological level and so on. And of course, scientific assessment adopts a kind of skepticism. Scientists are trained to not accept claims without strong evidence. Of course, it's a selective skepticism. I mean, if you can be skeptical of scientific methods themselves and of the ability for science to really unveil the truth. And there's whole domains of inquiry like the history of science or science and technology studies where people, really call into question in their analyses what people think is a common sense truth that science can unveil. All of this is about some of the limitations of scientific assessment. And in our communities, I don't hear people saying we need more science in here. Let's get those researchers, lined up to come do experiments on what works. No. Rather, what I hear is a reliance on indigenous ways of knowing. I mean, this is a growing field in Native and Indigenous studies that I think has started to make an appearance in mental health. But, these things are come up organically in our community as well. I remember in 2009 collaborating with the Blackfeet Nation's addiction program to try to figure out how we might develop an alternative addiction treatment that was based and grounded in Blackfeet therapeutic tradition rather than, say, in 12 steps or the AA program. And I remember I was working with a cultural counselor who had decided that it would be best for us to consult some of the grassroots ceremonial traditionalists on the reservation about how best to develop a program. And so we were in a ceremonial lodge of the Blackfeet Crazy Dog Society. This is a group of traditionalists who are committed to reclaiming or revitalizing what they call the old Blackfeet religion. And there we were sitting, ready to ask when they were ready for us to ask, if they could help us design an alternative program. And finally, they found a break in their activities and they turned to us and said, okay, what is it you want? And Danny Edwards, who's the cultural counselor at the addiction program I was partnering with, turned to me and said, Joe, take it away. So I said to this ceremonial leader, we are really interested in trying to draw on traditional precedents for remedying addiction. And yet in the outside world, academic researchers don't yet know that traditional practices can remedy addiction. And before I could get the rest of the sentence out, the lodge erupted in laughter. It was utterly comical to the 30 people participating in this ceremony that the outside world did not know that traditional practices could remedy addiction. To them, it was transparently obvious. Why? Because so many of them, as the leader said to me, everyone sitting in this lodge is proof, living proof that these traditions can remedy addiction. And so he was really referring to, I think, the authority of a kind of personal firsthand experience. And the kind of experience that can be narratively conveyed, but there's no higher authority in terms of knowing something than if you've experienced it firsthand. And so it's personal, it's immediate, it's firsthand, not distance, not coming from authorized scientists or anything like that. And I think this is why there's this interest in Indian country in not evidence-based practice so much, but in practice-based evidence, in what we know from our own experience to be true, and are trying to make that accessible and widely acknowledged in important ways. So just to summarize, we have this alternative science, a different parallel but alternative way of thinking about the psychiatric mental health endeavor. When it comes to these domains of distress, well-being, intervention, and evaluation, distress, it's not mental disorders, but historical trauma that people are interested in. In well-being, it's not neoliberal individualism, but rather relational selfhood that are of interest to our communities. When it comes to intervention, it's not empirically supported treatments or evidence-based practice, but rather reclaimed healing traditions. And when it comes to evaluation, it's not scientific studies, but indigenous ways of knowing that give the grounds for how we might proceed. So I tried to set all this out for you today in terms of this early career lesson that gave me a heads up. Look, there's questions that we have on our communities about the relevance and the appropriateness of these mental health treatments and technologies that you've been trained in. And then the past 2.5 decades have been an opportunity to register in systematic fashion the different kinds of objections and the different kinds of alternatives that our own community members have put forward. And I've tried to set that forth in reviewing this alternative science. Now, I've written about this and about a lot of other related things. Each of those domains, I have papers that I've tried to unpack this stuff in. It's all available on my website. So my surname is Gone. It's the English word gone. That's because our family name, my great-grandfather was sent to boarding school. They, supposed to give him his father's Indian name as his surname. And so it was Gone to War. They just clipped it to Gone. But in my website, it's Gone to War. You can find almost all of my publications available for free download there. And so here we are, 40 minutes later. Let me thank you for your attention today and turn it back to the folks to see if we can get a couple questions or two. Thank you.
Oh, there
Thank you
are,
so
Lydia.
much. Holly, are you going to say a word? Oh. Okay. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to just listen to you again. It was just an amazing amount of information. I am Livia Davis, and I see myself as a non-native guest in this native space. And I am just here to really look to make sure that there's an opportunity for you to ask any questions, or if you have some reflections you'd want to share, because there was so much good information. I did also ask in the chat box if you have some there. I'll just give it a couple of minutes to see if any of you have reflections. All right, so I see a couple coming in. I have Mariel saying, I very much appreciate you sharing this knowledge. And we have a question from Sean asking, how do we address historic trauma? And I don't know if you can see that question. Joseph, if you have a kind of just a few minutes of thoughts on that. I know that's a big question, but just wanting to throw it out there to you.
Well, it is a big question, and thanks for asking it, because we do want to know about this. And historical trauma itself, as it's been conceptualized and promoted, is already part of the solution, because the idea of historical trauma is that you're not in this alone. It's not because you as an individual person are deficient or defective in some way that we went through this together. It's a shared experience. And so that already reframes the problems or the suffering that an individual is coping with into a shared endeavor, and then makes it a domain where collective action can occur. So I think that's one of the keys, the benefits of the historical trauma framework to begin with. I think a second one is to recognize that indigenous therapeutic approaches and activities are understood to be therapeutic. And from the time historical trauma was really fronted in indigenous health in the 1990s by people like Ed Duran and Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and Bonnie Duran, the idea was that it lends itself to healing in part by ceremony and ritual from our traditional leaders. And so that's another really key resource that can help with it. I think a third thing that might suggest in some ways something to be cautious about with historical trauma trauma sort of means psychological injury. And the idea that we all suffer from historical trauma is sort of akin to saying we're all wounded in some important way. But we wouldn't want to oversimplify how human beings react to experiences like colonial subjugation. Woundedness or injury is one thing that often happens to plenty of people, and we want to be respectful and acknowledge and try to intervene in that. But sometimes people are resilient in the face of those kinds of assaults. Sometimes people are resistant in the face of those kinds of assaults. And so, I think a big question might be, ideally we want to do both of these things, but if you had to trade off, would you rather pursue justice or pursue healing? And I think the danger of healing is that you can maybe heal in the context of ongoing injustice, but I don't think you can remedy justice without also having healing come from that. So that's one of those trade-offs that I think we want to be careful about when we think about remedying historical trauma. Thank you for the question.
Well, thank you. There's a lot to consider there. And there's one more question that's come in. And it is, how do you work with an individual who doesn't know their traditional healing practices or how to access them?
Yeah, so this is at the level of like individual work with someone, a client or a patient. I mean, you have to obviously follow a person's lead. As you know, in our communities, we have people who are, like born again Christians who feel like that these kinds of Indian rituals are like diabolical, so obviously such a person is not going to be that open to this sort of thing, and they shouldn't be made to be. So part of the lesson here, I think, is that there's a wide range of different kinds of traditions people can draw on for strength and coping in times of suffering and distress. And, one thing we do know from the best surveys is that Indian people are pretty religious. So, you don't have tons of atheists, at least not in the scientific research that's been done. Of course, it's a little dated now. And so whatever the religious tradition is, there's probably health and help that can come through leaning or relying on that in some way. And so I think that's one thing to do. I think the other thing is to, obviously try to inform people what they're willing to hear about and refer to people. Hopefully you have a list of folks or know people in your communities who would be good for such a person to approach or be approached by. So I think there's ways to link into kind of our referral networks for some people who haven't had opportunity. I know that I did a project with the Urban Indian Health Clinic in Detroit that was all about the generations of people who lived in the urban metropolitan Detroit area, Indian people who maybe didn't know anything about their traditional spirituality. And so what I was commissioned to do with my research team in partnership with the clinic was develop a kind of traditional spirituality 101 for these individuals. And we developed a whole curriculum built around the sweat lodge ceremony, all quote by Indians for Indians with, traditional ceremonial leaders consulting. So, it's not the kind of thing that it was not open to the public or anything like that. It was just for Native people. But that's a way that I think you can try to help folks who have been alienated from those traditions but are interested in them to learn about them in ways that could be beneficial health-wise.
Thank you so much. There's a couple of more questions coming in, but I know we're running low on time. I think the presentation was such that you just keep having more and more thoughts and reflections as we have a chance to kind of think about everything that you shared. Please come to have the questions coming. They're important to us, but I'm going to turn it over to Holly Echohawk for, to take our next steps. Thank you so much.
Sure. Joe, that was fantastic. Always enjoy listening to you and all of your, just deep thinking on super important topics. And thank you for sharing Traveling Thunder stories with us. And I think some of the most important questions is behavioral health, conventional Western behavioral health is, and we all know this, we see it, foreign and suspect. So the question is, and Renee I can see your chats coming in. Your question is really important, Renee, about how do we bridge the tribal traditional beliefs and practices with behavioral health? Both have their assets, both are needed, maybe in different emphasis depending on the individual. And know that everything you all are putting in the chats, we review, and it'll help us plan for our 2023 series, which will start in January. And I also just want to thank my friend Joe and Professor Gahn, formal and informal, for the real showing us the brilliance of coming up with your concept of alternative science. It is super awesome. And just appreciate it a lot. I know we're running out of time. Thank you all for joining us as always. And you saw that Brian put into the chat that you will all receive the PowerPoint and the link to the audio within a week, usually within a couple of days. And I think with that, we're going to go ahead and move out. You know, we always end with a native video again, and Brian may have a comment to say about the continuing education credit again. And thank you so much, my good friend, Joe Gahn.
Yes, thank you, Holly. Make sure you complete the evaluation. It's on the screen, or it's also in the chat that Emily has been posting. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Bernice Jordan or myself, and we'll be happy to answer those questions or direct you to the source of the answers. So, and we'll end with the spoken word by Lalo June.
It is dawn. The sun is rising in the sky, and my grandmother and I are singing prayers to the horizon. This morning she's teaching me the meaning of Honjon. Although there's no direct translation from Diné-Bizaad, the Navajo language, into English, every living being knows what Honjon means. For Honjon is every drop of rain. It is every leaf on every tree. It is your every eyelash. It is every feather on the bluebird's wing. Honjon is undeniable beauty that surrounds us. And my grandmother knows this well, for she speaks a language that grew out of the desert floors, like redstone arms reaching into the sky and praising creation for all of its brilliance. Honjon is remembering that you are a part of the earth's brilliance. My grandmother knows this well, for she speaks the same language as a Lukachukai snowstorm, the same language of hooves hitting the dirt on birthdays, for she was a midwife and would gallop to the women in labor, until she became fluent in the language of suffering mothers, fluent in the language of joyful mothers, fluent in the language of handing glowing newborns to their creators. Honjon is like this, she says. It is an experience, but it's not something you can experience on your own, the eagles tell us, as they lock talons in the stratosphere and fall to the earth as one. Honjon is like this, she says. It is inter-beauty. And my grandmother, she knows this well, for she speaks the same language as the male rain, which shoots lightning boys through the sky and pummels the green corn children and huddles the horses against the cliff sides in the early afternoon. She also speaks the language of the female rain, which sends the scent of dust and sage into our homes, and casts rainbows in the sky. Us Diné, we know what Honjon means, and each and every living being knows what Honjon means. And I think that deep down inside, we know what Honjon does not mean. Like the days we walk in sadness, like the days we live in fear, like the days we live for money, or like the days when we live for fame, or like the day when the conquistadors came, climbed down from their horses and told us that they were going to take the mountains. We knew this was not Honjon because we knew you could not own a mountain, but we knew we could make it Honjon once again. So we took their silver swords and we took their silver coins and we melted them with fire and buffalo hide bellows. and recast them into beautiful turquoise and silver jewelry pieces and placed it around their necks. We took the silver helmets straight off of their heads and transformed it into a fearless beauty. We made jewelry. Honjon is like this, my grandmother says. It is the healing of our broken hearts. It's the prayer that carried us through genocide and disease. It's the prayer that will carry humanity through anything, through this global warming, through this global fear that dances thin as illusion, like a shadow in our minds. This morning, my grandmother is teaching me something very important. She's teaching me that sometimes the easiest and most elegant way to defeat an army of hatred is to simply stand before it and sing to it. Sing to it beautiful songs until it falls to its knees and surrenders to you. It will do this, she says, because it will have finally found a sweeter fire than revenge, a sweeter fire even than greed. It will have found heaven. It will have found Honjon. And so, my grandmother is talking now to the colors of the sky at dawn. And she's saying, Honjonahas ling, Honjonahas ling, Honjonahas ling, Honjonahas ling, which means beauty and joy are restored again. It is dawn, my friends. Wake up. The night is over.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you back next month. Have a good one. Bye.